It is celebrating its 70th birthday this week, but if you believe France's president, the NATO military alliance is on life support. So what does the future hold? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. It's helped to prop up European and US power in the global system for 7 decades now, but NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is in mortal danger, says Emmanuel Macron.
In conflict and crisis across the globe, NATO has been a major player for the last 70 years. Created to provide a first line of defense against the Soviet Union in Europe, it has 29 member states and 20,000 active personnel. Current operations include Afghanistan, Kosovo and the Mediterranean, and providing an air deterrent against Russia. One of its key principles, known as Article 5, is that an attack on one member is an attack on all. But in recent years, NATO has come under scrutiny. US President Donald Trump has accused European nations of not paying enough on defense. And in Europe, there is concern about Trump's commitment to NATO, with French President Emmanuel Macron warning the alliance was experiencing a brain death. The 70th anniversary summit in London may be less of a celebration and more like crisis talks. These could be important days for the future of NATO.
Let's say hello to our guests from Brussels. We welcome Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General at NATO in the United States. Tom Sutton joins us, Professor of Political Science at Baldwin Wallace University. With me in the studio, Robert Fox, Defence Editor at the Evening Standard, printed here in London, and Samir Puri, visiting lecturer in War Studies at King's College London. Great to have you all along. Thomas, let me come to you first of all. What will President Trump have made of what Emmanuel Macron said?
Well, I think he would agree in one part, and that is that President Trump has 2 levels when it comes to NATO. One, he constantly talks about the need for the NATO member countries to pay their share, continuing to criticize and comment on the fact that, in his perception, NATO countries need to pay more, the U.S. pay less. I think on another level, he would agree that NATO in some ways is not up to speed. It's been a bit sclerotic in his view when it comes to what they're supposed to be doing. Particularly with the involvements in the Middle East. And then finally, I think the whole concept of this grand alliance and this level of commitment of countries to one another is something that President Trump is a bit skeptical of. He prefers to deal bilaterally, the United States with one other or maybe 2 other countries at a time. So in total, I think on one level he would agree with Macron, but for different reasons.
Okay, Jamie Shea, it was set up initially to deter the Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The Soviet invasion isn't going to happen. Is there still a very real threat that NATO is prepared for?
Well, certainly, if you look at the behavior of Russia in Central and Eastern Europe since 2014, annexing the territory of a neighboring state, invading then another portion of the territory of that neighboring state, organizing with no advance notice and no transparency, very threatening, intimidatory exercises along NATO's borders, violating NATO airspace and keeping up a constant din of hostile rhetoric against NATO. You may say that's not quite the same as the Soviet Union in its heyday, but if you're in the Baltic states, if you're Poland, if you're on NATO's eastern flank, you're certainly not living in a very comfortable situation, and you'd certainly be looking for NATO to provide the same sort of protection and collective defence that it provided back in the days of the Cold War. So where you stand is very much where you sit.
Okay, if you happen to be in Warsaw and you saw what happened in Ukraine, remind us why those countries would be grateful for NATO over what happened in Ukraine.
Well, the simple fact of the matter is that no NATO member state, and today there are nearly 30 of them, has ever suffered an armed attack. So NATO's been a very effective, time-tested insurance policy, and that's why still a number of European countries want to join. But they've seen over the last decade Russia turn its back on democracy, turn its back on the...
Sorry to interrupt, but what did it do in Ukraine, NATO?
Well, it essentially in 2014 annexed Crimea, which is the internationally recognised...
I know Russia did that, but what did NATO do?
A forward defence. It's been giving reassurances.
Sorry, Jamie, I'll come back to you in a minute.
Both soft and hard power. I'm absolutely with Jamie Shea. It's a guarantee of support. Some people would say, some architects and commanders in NATO, as Jamie well knows, at the turn of the century, thought that the promissory note was too strong, particularly when they admitted the Baltic republics to the alliance, because the Baltic, with all of this, you come into Article 5. Not that Ukraine.
So we should point out Article 5 is if one member country is attacked, then the others have to respond.
It's all for one and one for all. The Three Musketeers, yes. And it's absolutely a fundamental principle. And there is the greatest doubt about this in the case of the two largest troop contributing members, namely the USA and Turkey, it has to be said, as if there is in the air, there might be in those two cases, a sort of unwritten derogation. No, in certain circumstances, we wouldn't support Article 5. In fact, Trump himself has been challenged on this.
And it has happened once, hasn't it? It happened with 9/11.
Yes, it did. And it nearly happened with one of the Iraq wars, when Turkey got really worried about an incursion over its borders and did raise the question of Article 5 at the NAC, the Northern Atlantic Council, and I think Jamie may well have been in Brussels at the time. But can I quickly say, this brain-dead remark, which of course has been rattling and reverberating round, just to take on Tom's point, actually, the single provocateur of that was Donald Trump's precipitous action, the infamous phone call of the 5th, 6th of October, in which he seemed to say, oh, go ahead to Erdogan, you can do your operation in northern Syria. And why NATO was upset, including particularly President Macron, is that there were NATO allies with troops working alongside the Americans.
And of course, Turkey's part of NATO.
No, but they hadn't been consulted. Yeah. And there was no hint of a consultation across the alliance.
But doesn't this prove, Samir, that Macron, to some extent, is right? NATO wasn't working.
He's right and wrong.
With that example.
Well, rather than saying, it's obviously if something is brain dead, the body can actually live on, which actually makes it quite a good analogy, because NATO on a day-to-day basis still exists, even if it doesn't quite have the central direction from a coherent US president. But I'd reformulate and say NATO is suffering the Rip Van Winkle challenge, which is we'd say that America is somewhat asleep in terms of its investment in multilateral institutions, as we've just heard.
Still gives the most money to NATO, 70%, I think.
The body lives on. The question is when America comes to, whether that's later in next year after the US election or in 4 years hence, that's when we really see, well, what is left of the alliance structure, what is left of the trust levels in the alliance structure. And to pick up Robert's point with regards to Turkey, we can manage that relationship with Turkey inside of the NATO tent, but doing so is going to erode goodwill inside the alliance. And really, it's that question, in 3 or 4 years hence, how much goodwill will there be left? How functional, how deployable will NATO still be?
Thomas, I'll come to you in just a moment to ask about the United States' position on the funding of NATO, among other things. But, Jamie, do you accept the suggestion that NATO, it acts as a deterrent, but at the moment it's pretty much asleep?
I would not accept that, and I'm saying that as an independent analyst these days and not simply as a former NATO official. First of all, NATO has shown over the last couple of years that it's able to get back into the business of collective defence. And whatever President Trump might say critically about NATO, the fact is, under his watch, the United States has been stationing more troops in Europe than it's had for the last couple of decades. In fact, just a couple of days ago, President Trump sent 1,000 extra US troops to Poland and a battalion to Lithuania. So if you look at what President Trump is doing in terms of budgets devoted to NATO, troop deployments, sending aircraft carriers over to Europe on NATO exercises, I think the Allies are seeing a high degree of the US commitment. That's the first point. I think the second point is that when President Trump and the US actually want to use NATO to actively come over and consult the European allies and work together, NATO produces a success. I mean, the example I'll give you is the INF Treaty, the Intermediate NATO Nuclear Forces in Europe Treaty. The United States believed that Russia was not abiding by that treaty. It worked with the Europeans to put the evidence on the table, and NATO came out with a common position on that treaty. So politically, NATO can work just as well as it works militarily, but it does depend on the willingness of the Trump administration to actually use it. I would say, just one other point very quickly, that if you look at the state of many other international organizations today, in an age where many people are turning their back on multilateralism, NATO is one of the few international organizations which is still in pretty good shape and working fairly well.
Okay, Robert, I will come to you in just a moment and talk about the article that you've written. And there was a loud exhalation of breath at something that was said. But Thomas, I want to come to you first of all. Does NATO offer the USA protection from Russia? Let's use Russia. It could be other countries as well. Does it protect the USA? It puts in 70% of the budget, 3.6% of GDP, almost double what the other countries put in. Is it value for money as far as the USA's self-interests are concerned?
Well, I think it is certainly in terms of trying to maintain the alliances that we have and the economic relationships that we have with Europe and with the NATO members. And of course, the best sign of an alliance is the lack of warfare. And so even though NATO may appear to be quiet, the fact that there hasn't been any open conflict in the member states among them or involving them is a sign of NATO's success. Now, as far as President Trump, he tends to listen a lot more to domestic voices, to what his constituents say, and they tend to be skeptical about these kinds of international agreements, be they trade or military. There is that whole question about, in the post-Cold War era, should there still be something like a NATO directly against Russia? Trump goes back and forth about Russia. There are, on the one hand, sanctions that have been periodically imposed on Russia as well as on Turkey. On the other hand, he seems to have a warm personal relationship with Vladimir Putin and with Erdogan. And so these mixed messages, I think, are what raise a lot of the questions about the U.S. commitment to NATO. The real question is this simply a personality in the presidency that will change when he leaves office, or is this a sign of a trend in U.S. foreign policy that may continue even into whoever becomes the next president, be that in 2021 or 2025.
Okay, well, we'll answer that question. We'll try to answer it.
Yeah,
you wanted to say something?
No, I'd like to answer that question. I think I'm absolutely with you, Tom. But at the high level, yes, there are all these questions, and there are within party politics in many of the European countries, as in the United States. There are ideological questioning about it. I would think I would go so far as to say that with his very idealistic view, Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party is not particularly interested in NATO, seeing it as an aggressive alliance. I've just had to back a letter to me through my newspaper from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which has accused me of promoting NATO as an aggressor encircling Russia and China. How you can get to such flat earth logic, I don't know. But the question that both David and Jamie asked, I think is a very important one. Can we come down from high strategy to the operational and the tactical? And that is where NATO is still very, very good. And sorry, to quote my own article to preempt you, I said for a country like Britain, it's the only game in town now. Now think, the things that Jamie was describing so eloquently, think of Russia's game of AAD, area access denial, which they do by subtle and very unsubtle means in areas like the Black Sea, where we've seen it over the Sea of Azov. The Eastern Mediterranean now is an open game area for all of this. Now, this is where what NATO brings to the party in presences and real activity with very good special forces, it is in the moral argument of the employment or the implicit employment of force. It's a force multiplier for the US. The US is much stronger. And this is the bit that I think that Trump doesn't quite get, because he's a dealer. He doesn't like alliances. He doesn't like treaties. He does everything transactionally, one by one, as if it was a property deal. Perhaps I'm exaggerating there. But I think that the Trump entourage immediately don't get this aspect of the moral force. And the moral component is terribly important here, that you, by having so many allies, they say, yeah, we're with you. Even if it's a broken down old Corvette, we will run it into the Eastern Mediterranean.
Can we go on to the practicalities here rather than the moral side of it?
Well, that's what it is, moral force, actually.
But in terms of being up to date, is NATO fit for the job?
Well, there is important aspects of the practical side, as Jamie's pointed out, that are still functioning quite well. And to build on that point, there is the enhanced forward presence which is the NATO deployments to Baltic states and to Eastern European countries, absolutely vital to reassure those capitals that the West is still with them, in particular after the Crimea annexation. Country like Romania, petrified because of the annexation of Crimea. Clearly, the Black Sea is a critical theatre of operation. In terms of the updating of the interoperability, because interoperability is the key thing that NATO.
Are you talking about
brings to
different
these.
countries having to work together with different
Right.
systems?
Troops on the ground,
Yeah.
aircraft being able to identify themselves, a same caliber of a rifle round. This stuff is built into the DNA of NATO. It's been functioning very well since the Cold War. But I do think there is something that goes on top of that, not to deflect back to the moral point, but there is something about the rhetoric and the idealism of how you present NATO, because NATO is a tool for deterrence. It's not a tool for aggression. Exactly. It's a tool for stopping people being tempted from taking these low-hanging fruit, and unless you accompany it with
so let me ask you this.
It's not very usable.
If Romania, you bring up Romania, if there was an incident that required a NATO response to something in Romania, would NATO be equipped to respond adequately?
Romania in particular is a really tough one. The Romanians have pushed at successive NATO summits for a permanent naval presence in the Black Sea to reassure them. Of course, NATO can't do that because of the Montreux Convention, which is a decades long ago pact that stops the demilitarization of that naval space. So NATO has done the next best thing, and it's stationing ships on a periodic basis, a visiting basis. That is reasonably good, but honestly, if the Russians really wanted to do something, it probably wouldn't be adequate in quick enough time, is my guess.
Jamie, let me quote you something from Robert's article. I'm sure he won't mind me this. He says that 29 partners now face the trickiest decade in NATO history. And you've referred to something as hybrid warfare. Tell us what you mean by that, and whether NATO, at least I think it was you, whether NATO's equipped to respond to the new challenges of the 21st century.
Well, hybrid warfare is a different form of confrontation. It doesn't mean attacking somebody across borders and seizing their land using tanks or aircraft. It means trying to undermine their societies, their economies, their social cohesion through things like cyber attacks, through dirty money, corrupt practices, through getting those countries dependent on certain monopolistic energy supplies, the fake news, disinformation campaigns, the interference in the elections that have been gripping Washington, obviously, since the last presidential election. So it's death by 1,000 cuts. In other words, trying to undermine people, not through one single great military strike, but by this sort of constant work every day to divide, to polarize societies. But at the end of the day, if it's done very well by very competent adversaries, it can achieve the same result as actually waging war. In other words, gaining control of the politics, of the society, of the mentality of a different country. So hybrid warfare is a different type of warfare, but it's warfare.
Okay, and who do you think has the upper hand at the moment, considering how much we've heard out of Russia? And I want to go on to other threats in just a moment. We've talked mostly about Russia, but who has the upper hand here?
Well, I think that certainly if you look at a situation, and we started our program today with this, where Russia took over Crimea, you could see that Russia definitely had the upper hand at that time through sneaking across the border the so-called little green men who didn't wear any military insignia. Nobody really knew who they were, obviously taking out the Ukrainian telecom system and all of that. But I think since that time, the NATO countries have been playing catch-up, and apart from stationing troops in Central and Eastern Europe, NATO has been working really hard on things like cyber defense, on improving its critical infrastructure, its overall resilience, working with the private sector that owns so many of these networks that are the target of hybrid warfare, like social media. And so my sense is that today NATO is developing a much more effective toolbox to respond. And if I can just give one very quick example, if you look at the attack in the United Kingdom that the Russian intelligence services carried out last year, using a Novichok nerve agent, you could see that the very next day, when the UK presented compelling evidence, all of the NATO countries collectively expelled hundreds of Russian diplomats. So I think that's a good example of turning something which is often low risk, high gain into an activity which
Thomas, Jamie mentions
low gain and high risk.
Mentions the fact that he believes that NATO to some extent may be playing catch up when it comes to threats from other countries besides Russia. Is NATO playing effective catch-up when it comes to the threats, let's say, from Iran, from, well, I don't know whether China's a NATO threat, but I mean, certainly threats from outside to the United States' interests?
Well, I think the question really is about what is NATO prepared to do in the future. And Iran clearly has its own schemes, its own designs on being a regional power. I think the most troubling development has been recently with this growing potential relationship between Russia, Turkey, and Iran vis-a-vis Syria. The United States pullout and lack of support for the Kurds was terrible. It was badly received over here. It was a terrible military and strategic error, although apparently we've just launched a new attack on ISIS forces. So I'm not sure how long that's going to last. But I do think that going forward, particularly the China question, you have to look at that one road, one belt policy that China is pursuing that takes them all the way into the shipping lanes of the oil industry, all the way over to Italy, all the way over to the eastern part of Africa and the Indian subcontinent. These are things that maybe not now or next year, but 5-10 years from now may become potential military threats, depending on the situation that might threaten China's economy or its interest in global expansion.
Okay, because it's not American territory, but there may well be American interests in East Africa. If there's some kind of threat to that, do you think NATO would get involved if China was the opponent?
I think it's a possibility in the same way that NATO got involved in the post 9/11 period, in the invasion of Afghanistan and even the invasion of Iraq. I think these are examples of where NATO has to expand to protect its own interests globally, and in the same way that the very reasons for NATO's development, and it was not just about thwarting a direct attack by the Soviet Union, but it was also about protecting and an expanded protection of those economic and political interests of not just the European continent, but also across the Atlantic to the United States. So it's maybe not be our borders, but certainly it is our strategic interests, political and economic interests, which are an extension of that in Europe and increasingly around the world.
Perhaps we can view the future of NATO in the prism of its successes and failures over the last 70 years.
Actually, geopolitics, it's got to be far more the new human geography. I was just thinking of what Tom was saying. There's a great friend of mine, Lucio Caracciolo, who's a great visionary and an Italian thinker, says, China is already a European power. It's a European player. Tom, as you rightly indicated, the participation I don't know whether they've managed to purchase Trieste and Genoa already. You go to Venice Airport, Marco Polo Airport, be a new Marco Polo, China arrives here. This is the new reality. And I think this is the new future of NATO, which is the old in the new. We're going to have to deal with whole new phenomena. We could go on for another 3 hours talking about the kind of thing that Jamie has mentioned. The fact that when you get to hard fighting, a lot of it is going to be done by mercenary contract forces. You get militias now. What you're seeing in the Syrian conflict is what I called in my article the Hezbollification of things. The Hezbollahs are a new phenomenon. Where does NATO come into this? NATO is a wonderful operational and tactical think tank and laboratory for ramming all these ideas together. And that's where I am skeptical about Trump's pullback, but I'm even more skeptical about Macron's view, which if you read in subsequent articles...
Robert, we love the fact that you make a lot of sense, but you make a lot of sense and it takes a lot of time.
But no, Europe can replace NATO.
I'm going to pitch it with
that's what Macron was saying. Macron was saying, we can't rely on NATO, we have to look after ourselves.
Well, firstly,
a
very quick defence of Venice. The Venetian Empire is always influenced by these St. Mark's
Oh,
Cathedral.
that's for another day. That's for another day. Sorry.
Byzantine influence.
Time's up, Samir. No, sir, I've got to go to Jamie. Got to go to Jamie on this one. Another 70 years? What do you reckon?
Yes, I think NATO will be around in another 70 years because the Western democracies are on the defensive at the moment. We see the rise of the new authoritarians. And basically, as Winston Churchill put it when he looked across the Atlantic, quoting Benjamin Franklin, if we don't hang together, assuredly we're going to hang separately.
Tell me what you think the most important thing we can learn to take us forward with NATO.
Well, from its past, definitely out-of-area operations, Afghanistan, Libya, less successful, defence of European territory, successful. I don't think NATO is actually going to develop any more capacity because, unfortunately, it's quite associated with Western colonialism. Sadly, if it goes out of area, inside of Europe, I still think it has a major role to play in the next few years.
OK, but that role is going to change. Is Macron going to see a European force to replace NATO at some point, even though Germany's Angela Merkel's basically told him to shut up about this?
I don't think so. I don't think a European army is a viable construct. It's a hypothetical entity. It will remain a go-to point of aspiration for pro-Europeanists, just as the failed European army was back in the 1950s. That didn't come to fruition either. I can't see it happening.
Okay. Quick final word, Robert, if you can, briefly.
I think NATO will be around because what it has proved, contrary to the critics, it's a very flexible tool. And I think that it has shown capacity, thanks to people like Jamie Shea, to reinvent itself and to rethink its tactics and technique. It's going to be a tremendous outsourcer. It's going to help a lot of those struggling polities, say in Africa, to how to put together a new security architecture. I don't think it's a done deal at all. And I think Macron is wrong to suggest that it can be replaced for Europe. I'm not saying it's irreplaceable, but I can't think of a better thing around at the moment.
Glad I could give you the last word, Robert. Thank you very much indeed. Samir, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Tom, very much indeed. I got my timing slightly wrong there, so we did go on, but apologies to you two if I didn't give you enough time towards the end. Fascinating to get your expertise. Thank you very much indeed. 70 years of NATO. Another 70 years? Well, the suggestion is that could be the case, but maybe we won't be around to see it, but some of you will. Thank you for watching. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team. Goodbye for now.